Greetings, Owen here, your friendly bike nerd. With many bars on stock bikes being over 800mm, sometimes trimming down your bars might be your first step in your setup. So we're going to show you some safe and easy steps of how you can make the chop. Bike geometry has changed and bikes have gotten slacker. They've also got longer and bars have gotten really wide, over 800mm. If you're arm endowed, that's great, but if you don't have the upper body and the arm stance for it to work, then you might need to trim your bars. We're going to take you through a step-by-step guide to make sure that your bars are perfectly set up. Okay, warning time. Cutting a bar, whether it be alloy or carbon, isn't essentially that dangerous, really. And it's not that hazardous because a saw in a guide, you're probably not going to cut yourself, but there are sharp things. And those sharp things, obviously the saw, could be the pipe cutter, but the bigger dangers are the bar materials. So aluminium is in itself is the grit that you get in sandpaper. So you do need to be really careful of smaller particles of that getting blown or driven into your eye. So if you're using a cutting tool, be very careful. So use goggles. With carbon, it brings up a whole new set of hazards. The carbon itself is sort of inert, but it's very, very sharp. It can get into your lungs and cause damage. It can cut into your eyes and cause damage. The other part of a carbon bar, about a third of the weight, is the resins, and those can be quite harmful too. With a carbon bar and cutting a carbon bar, we're not going to make lots and lots of dust. So if we control it really carefully and we minimize any of the dry fibers getting out, we should be safe. Ideal world, we want to be doing it with a air extraction system, but if we can get away with minimizing that dust, wearing a mask, wearing eye protection as just a one-off, we should be okay, but be very careful. It's not stuff to play around with. We've talked about cutting a bar. Why might you cut a bar? Well, 800mm is really quite wide and lots of people aren't that wide. There's lots of factors involved, so there's no hard and fast, this is the bar width that you exactly need. And those factors are going to be your arm span or wingspan as some people call it, how strong your upper body is, how wide your upper body is, and where and what you're riding. A good analogy of working out how to select a bar width and whether you need to trim it down would be to think about how, when you do a press up, if you do press ups, is if you've got a really extremely wide arm stance, it's really hard to do a press up. And conversely, if you do a really extremely narrow press up, it's also really hard, but there's a magical midway point. So for people who are probably under 6 foot, maybe running under 760mm bar width would be a good idea. By talking about bar width, we're talking about from tip to tip, and when we're wanting to cut the bar down, we're talking about chopping small sections of the bar off on either end. And I know this might sound a little bit daft, but I've almost done it myself. We're taking sections off either side. So if you've got an 800mm bar and you're going down to 740, you're going to have to remove 30mm from each side versus making it a lopsided bar. I know it sounds daft, but I've nearly done it myself. And while we're talking about cutting, again, it's a classic line. I think it's related to carpenters, but the line of measure twice, cut once really does apply to a bar. And that's because we can't add bits of the bar back on again. So make sure you do measure it twice. Again, I have done this wrongly and the bar was narrower than it was meant to be. So measure twice, cut once. I say cut once, we are cutting twice because we're cutting both sides of the bar, but effectively it's one cut. Depending on which tools you use, whether you use a pipe cutter or a saw, we're going to go into those in more detail a little bit later, you can do that on bike, so you don't have to remove the bar. Obviously you have to remove your grips and make sure that you measure. With a carbon bar, I would say it's probably easier to take the bar off because you want to minimize any of that carbon dust. And the best way of doing that is off bike. With the hinged clamps and with bolt-on grips, it's not the faff that it used to be. So probably the first step, especially if you're cutting a carbon bar, is to remove it. If you're cutting an alloy one, just leave it on and make sure the controls or any hoses are out of the way from the saw or cutting tools. Cutting bars, we've got a number of different options, as we've sort of already mentioned. So a pipe cutter, as you might imagine, is for cutting pipes. You can get dedicated ones for cutting handlebars on bikes, and they're really good. Obviously, there's pros and cons to all the tools, so we'll run through the one with a pipe cutter. It can take time because you're rotating and pressing the bar and crimping it and cutting it slowly. So sometimes it takes time, but it also probably needs a little bit more finishing up, so you might have to spend a little bit more time with a file. The other option is a saw and guide. So I would recommend not doing a freestyle cut. If you've got a really good eye and really good hands, then maybe you can try. I definitely recommend using a saw guide. You get a couple of different saw guides, and that's down to the different blades. So this one here is the SG8, which is a dedicated carbon bar cutting tool. You might wonder why it's a dedicated one, like is the clamp different? The clamp is exactly the same as the other version. It's the width of the blade that's different. So the carbon cutting blade, which you'll need, is very, very fine pitch, and it means that it won't damage, or it will limit the damage that it does to the bar. So yeah, there's options for cutting. You can do pipe cutter, you can do a saw. Just be mindful that if you're cutting carbon, you can only cut it with a carbon bladed saw. With alloy, you could cut it with a hacksaw, or you could use a pipe cutter. So you've decided to use a pipe cutter. To be fair, it's my preferred option too. So offer up the cutting tool to the bar, align the discs to the line that you want to cut, and then lightly tighten the tool up onto the bar, just so that the second cutting tool indents the bar slightly as you rotate it. Double check that it's in the right place. If it is, spin the tool around, allowing the tool to score the metal of the bar. Depending on the hardness of the bar, you'll have to tighten up the second disc as you go along. It might happen really quickly. Be careful, don't rush this. Allow the discs to slowly press into the material and allow the tool to do the work. You don't have to race round. Repeat until you hear a nice creaking or cracking sound. Now slow down the rotations a little until you feel the final ping of the last section of metal just breaking away. Be really mindful of the sharp swarf and the raw edge of this fresh cut. With the bar now cut, it's time to inspect the tool's work and assess how much filing you need to do. Often with a pipe cutter, the outer edge is smooth, if a little raised, so sometimes you might need to do a little bit more filing. Depending on how tight the outer grip clamp is that you're running on your grips and the manner in which the bar is deformed, you may need to work a little bit more away on the outer ridge of the handlebar before you slide it on. So yeah, double check that the grip will slide on and then just work the bar until it's finished and smooth. Now it's time to trim the other side. Once that's done, you've got a freshly set of trimmed bars. So go and enjoy your bike. Now we're going to show you how to cut a carbon bar with a saw and guide technique, or tools even. The techniques are exactly the same to trim an alloy bar, but you don't have to take as much precaution in terms of the alloy not being quite as toxic as the carbon bar, but we'll run through step by step. With a carbon bar, you've got to use a saw. You can't use a pipe cutter. A pipe cutter crushes things, and with carbon, that crushes the carbon. It also crushes those fibres that run through it. And because it's a composite, damage one part of it, and then those cracks can run through the laminate. So please don't use a pipe cutter to cut carbon. You'll need a hacksaw, and one with either a really fine pitch tooth blade or the dedicated carbon blade that Paik Tool do. So because of the saw blade, it's quite fat. It's not dissimilar to sort of like a tile cutting tool, like some of the ceramic ones that you'll see. Because of that saw blade, you need a dedicated saw guide. It's got a much wider face on it here and allows the blade to cut through. Now, I've made the mistake of using a normal blade with this wider guide, and effectively the results are pretty messy. So only use this guide when you're using the wider blades, because otherwise you'll just get lost and make a really wavy cut. With the carbon, you can't score it like we've scored the alloy bar to mark where we're going to align the cutting tool. So use a pen. In the UK, we've got a whiteout marker pen called a Tipex. That's a great tool. Sometimes you'll have highlighted cutting sections on the tool, and you can just simply use a biro or a marker just to simply line up that cut. Align the tool with your cut line. So really good lighting helps here, and just kind of like eyeball it and clamp it in place. Use the saw just to double check the alignment. So don't do any cutting yet, but just use it just to check that you're in the right space, which we are. Now it's time to set it up. With the guide in position correctly, which we checked with the saw, just make sure the bar clamp is nice and tight, then position the lower metal section into your vise. Okay, now we need to foam stuff up to minimize all of that dust. So we'll get busy with foam, and that can be, well, we've got PT's foaming cleaner, which is great, but you could use a shaving cream because they foam up as well. Anything to trap all that dust. We also want to put lots of paper towel or workshop towel down as well to absorb that and capture it. Before we do any cutting, we're going to mask up and glove up to reduce the risk of exposure to the hazardous carbon fibre dust. Don't do any cutting yet. Blitz the guide, the saw blade with as much foam as possible. With the saw placed in the guide and ready to cut, as you may know, metal blades are directional, so you can kind of drive forward and then you ease up on the return stroke. Carbon blades are unidirectional, so you're cutting in both directions, but keep an even pressure on both strokes. The smoother saw stroke will help create a cleaner cut and save you time. And it'll save you time by meaning that any additional finishing that you have to do at the end will be a very minimal. So stay smooth and allow the saw to do the work. Keep that pressure even and steady. It's not a race. We want a really smooth, clean cut. Reapply any of the foaming spray if it's beginning to migrate or drip onto the floor. You need to ensure that the blade and the bar are still foamy and still wet, and that means that it will trap any of the small dust particles. And when you're beginning to cut through to the very end of the bar, start to ease off gently on the pressure that you applied, and again, allow the saw to do the work of cutting. Okay. You've cut the bar, well done. Now it's time to clean up. And I'd recommend doing this before you tackle the other side of the bar. So with the bar still in its clamp, make sure you take away all of the workshop towels that you've put down. Again, wrapping them all up to minimize any dust escaping. If you need to damp down sections as well, if sections haven't stayed foamy, do that. Wrap all of that up and put it into a sealed plastic bag and put it into your waste disposal units. Okay, with the foam mostly removed, it's time to remove the bar from the clamp, and now we can clean it up again with a little bit of water to see how fine the cut is. Be really careful around the raw edge of the bar. You can often see where there's small delaminations like there is here. Damp down the surface before you start working on the carbon bar, and then just clean the edge of the bar, so that kind of outer edge and the inner edge, just to make sure that if there are any sticking out bits, again, clean the edges of the bar and just work off carefully any rough edges. Work the edges as little as possible. You don't want to kind of risk any additional delaminations, so work the bar as minimal as possible. The carbon bar has now got a raw, unfinished edge. It should be fairly smooth, but here's an extra sort of like bonus point to make your carbon parts last much longer, and that's to seal the end of this raw carbon. You can either use super glue or nail varnish. Carefully run the super glue or nail varnish around the raw edge of the bar and just allow it to dry. This should seal the lamination layers of carbon away from kind of moisture or anything that could damage it. So wait until that's all dry before you carry on working. As we mentioned, carbon fibre dust is hazardous, so please carefully dispose of all the contaminated foam and wet towels. With the raw edges prepped and both ends of the bar cut, you can return it to your bike, tightening up to the manufacturer's settings, check that all the levers are in the right place, and yeah, you're ready to go. Well done, you've cut your carbon bar. Good job.